Thank you. My name is Sean Moulton. I'm the Director of Open Government Policy at the Center for Effective Government, formerly OMB Watch. And we're here to speak about spending transparency.
My name is Earl Devaney, and I'm a retiree at this point after serving 41 years in government. My last position was chairman of the Recovery Board, so I'm a new convert to the wonders of transparency.
So I'll start off by talking a little bit about what I think the open government community wants as of late in terms of spending transparency. The short answer, of course, is more. And the longer answer is a little bit more complex. So there's a couple different parts. I think the first part is greater data quality. We need data standards government-wide so that each agency is reporting the same thing in the same field, and we feel confident about that. We need to have, the earlier panel talked about baking things in, and I think the same is true for data quality in spending transparency. We need it baked in. You shouldn't be able to enter a non-existent zip code or a non-existent congressional district code. These should be things that if you enter something and it doesn't make sense for the field, the system rejects it. It should be for the agency or the recipient, whoever's reporting the information. This is within our grasp, and we should have it. And then we should have a review process that we periodically are checking the data, looking for problems, and trying to solve them. Another subpart of that data quality specifically are IDs. Now, this is a real challenging thing, but we need IDs for who's receiving the money, who's giving the money, and an ID, a consistent ID for the different awards, so we can track the transactions, total them up. Right now, the reality is we get different IDs being used all the time, and it makes it difficult to really understand how the data all fits together. Moving on to the more data. We need actual spending data. Right now, what we primarily get is obligation data, when the government promises to spend money or intends to spend money. And you get it very timely, you get it very quickly. Sometimes spending doesn't happen for a while, but we really need to know how much gets spent, because right now in the USA spending system, you get an obligation, and sometimes you get then later a de-obligation as they adjust because they didn't spend as much money as they thought, or they get new obligations and they add up over time. And so this is very confusing. It leads to some very interesting numbers. Sometimes there's actually a negative number for a company in a particular year or month that you're looking at, and we get calls asking, did they give money back to the government? Which never happens. So IDs, getting an ID system worked out that really is useful. The next thing I would say is multi-tier recipient reporting. We really got that for the first time in the Recovery Act. We got the first tier of subrecipients, and it was terrific. It was very useful. A lot of times the government gives money to a contractor or to a state, and then they wind up giving a substantial portion of it out to another recipient, another contractor. In the Recovery Act, I think the last figures I saw were that about 40 to 45% of the money that went out from the federal government then went out to a subrecipient. So it's a large piece. So if you want to know who's actually getting the money, who's actually doing the work, we have to follow the money down the chain to who's actually doing the work. Award documents. Right now in USA spending, there's a description field for what the money's being spent on. But more often than not, it's almost useless. It's for IT support. It's for construction. You don't know what they're constructing, who they're supporting, how many people. The Recovery Act, again, we got much more detailed description fields, and that was a real step. But I think now we're really looking down the road and saying, we want the documents. We want the contract. We want the grant. Now, there are certainly challenges with this. Confidential business information, intellectual property rights. So it may take a change in how we create these documents, where they're created electronically with some areas of the document already stated to be where confidential business information is or intellectual property rights. And that doesn't come out, and the rest of it's automatically released. and then a lot of us would actually probably fight over what is withheld, but we narrow the area where we're having those fights over what more information should be put out. Another big piece is performance information. You get the description, that's the first step. This is what you agreed to provide to the government and do for this money. But then we need to know what happened. Did they go over budget? Did they take too long? Or did they deliver what they said they would deliver with that money? And we need to evaluate it. And again, we've seen some of this. Recovery Act had fields where as recipients were reporting more and more, they told us whether or not they were 50% done or fully complete with the contract. The IT dashboard that Vivek Kundra put out talked about agencies' IT spending and whether or not these projects were over budget, over time, and it really changed whether or not these contracts continued. One of the last new pieces of information that I think we really need is tax expenditure data. There's a lot of spending that goes on where the government actually cuts a check, but there's also a lot of spending in a way where the government creates loopholes for certain industries, certain activities, and this again happened in the Recovery Act. A lot of the stimulus that went on was through tax expenditures, changes in the tax code, and we didn't get any transparency on that. We got a lot of transparency on the money that was being spent and no transparency as to who really benefited from those tax expenditures. And then the last piece, and then I'll kick it over to Earl, is we have to figure out a way to pay for this. And as we got brought up in the first panel, we're in sequestration, tighter budgets, and this is not going to be an easy thing. The good news is we get a huge return on the investment in this kind of spending. With greater accountability, greater transparency, we wind up finding problems, finding waste, finding fraud, finding abuse, and eliminating it and getting a real savings in how we spend our money. So I think that's really, from my perspective, what we're looking for in spending transparency. And Earl, can we get it?
I'm trying to figure out, Sean, whether you were complimenting me or just, and I think you were, and the efforts we made, but I'm going to be the first to say that we didn't go far enough. That I wish I had another 2 or 3 years in government to bring some of those concerns, to rest. And I think that we have to look at recovery as a sort of a grand experiment, sort of a proof of concept, if you will. Could we do that? Could we bring, as the Act required us to, an unprecedented level of transparency to government spending? In the rearview mirror, it looks like we made a good step forward in that regard. But there is a ton of work to do. I'm concerned, quite frankly, that some of the lessons we learned in recovery aren't going to live on. And so I'm doing everything I can to support legislation such as the Data Act and other pieces of legislation that attempt to take some of the lessons we learned and export them to the rest of government. Let me say a couple things about data. The first thing I would say is I'm not going to even go near USA spending and the accuracy in there. But what we sought to do was to for the very first time, collect data directly from the recipients as opposed to looking at it the way that USA spending does. And so the question was, and I think there might have been 10 people in Washington that thought that we could actually successfully in a quality way get data from recipients. I wasn't one of them when we first started this experiment. But I came to believe that recipient data is actually the best way to go, that it is more accurate than a government person putting the information into a system, that people who have ownership of that data, with the amount of transparency that we had where people could, American citizens, reporters, pundits, could take a look and see what they were saying they were doing with that money. They tried very hard to make sure that it was right. Yes, they made mistakes. Over time, we built in ways for them to correct those mistakes. The Recovery Act, as some of you may know, said that the only way that the data could be changed once it was put in was by the recipients. I assume that was the intent of that was that they wanted to make sure that nobody in the government could change the data to skew the figures. So I thought that was a good thing, and we baked ways into the system where the recipients, if they had made an honest mistake or we saw something in the data that we didn't like, we could go back to them and ask them to rethink it and re-input that data. So I think the quality of the data in recovery.gov, while not perfect certainly, is far better than any other spending data ever assembled by the U.S. government. And so we proved that recipient data really works, and I would hope that that would be one of the lessons we could export. I'm a little dismayed to hear that there are curmudgeons out there that are trying to thwart that within the Data Act. So I'm a believer that recipient data works, and I think it should be one of the lessons we export to the rest of government. The other thing we learned was that the federal, and you talked a little bit about this, Sean, the federal government desperately needs single alphanumeric, a numbering system for grants and contracts. 29 different agencies with recovery money, 29 different numbering systems. Some with letters in it, some with dashes, some with semicolons. The bottom line is when you try to build a platform where you mash all that data up from the agencies, and we tried very hard every quarter to cross-check what the agencies said they gave out, after it took them a year to be able to do that for us, to what the recipients were saying that they were getting and spending. We spent weeks trying to reconcile the data simply because the agencies were all using different sort of numbering systems. Even within agencies, they use different numbering systems. So some of them go back to George Washington. So I have been an advocate, and I think there are others in government looking at the lessons of recovery that say, isn't it time to move to a single numbering system for contracts and grants? And of course the agencies howl about that. They don't like to be told what to do because, quite frankly, it works for them, and they're not particularly interested if it works, government-wide. So there's a little bit of resistance to that, but I think it's way past time that happened. I think that the data can be quickly displayed, quality controlled, and uniquely arrayed to show unprecedented levels of transparency by use of new technology. We used, as many of you probably know, on recovery.gov, mapping, the ability for the citizen to come on to the site, put their zip code in there, and see where the money was being spent in their own neighborhood. And as we went around the country and talked to focus groups about the website and what we were doing, we heard a couple things. They hated the administration, they hated the president, they hated me, they hated the board, but they loved the maps. And so I'm a big believer in using geospatial technologies in regard to transparency to show at least where the money is going, and hopefully the technology will allow us to get better and better about when you actually click on that dot in your neighborhood, you see more things than you do right now. But we brought it down to that level, and it became very popular with the American public. Cloud technology is obviously something that we were the first government agency, entity to go to the cloud. Vivek and I gave a news conference with the hope that we could encourage a speedier move to the cloud by other components of government. I had, of course, with a sort of a law enforcement background, a great deal of concern about security. I actually became convinced that we had twice as much security by going to the cloud than we had just with our own security. So I was perfectly willing to move our whole show to the cloud as soon as we could, and I was proud to stand with Vivek when we did that. And I think those technologies, geospatial and cloud, bring an awful lot of new opportunities for transparency of government spending. The other thing I would say about transparency is it causes, as a natural result, embarrassment. We were embarrassed. Sean mentioned briefly one of our embarrassments when our zip codes, when our congressional districts ended up all sort of combobulated in the first run we did with recovery. We had actually, it didn't take long to fix it. You can put a logic check in there that says if you put the wrong congressional district in there, and it doesn't match the zip code, it'll stop you. But we didn't have that in there when we first started, and I spent a very, very uncomfortable day in front of Chairman Darrell Issa and others about why I had 2 district states with the 95th district and the 107th district. And what it turned out to be is when the recipients went in there and they got to the districts, and it turns out a lot of people don't know what congressional district they live in. They just put any old number in there, and the way we had the system set up originally, it let them go on. Now, very easy fix. It stopped them. So embarrassment is a sort of an inevitable result of transparency. I can remember some very uncomfortable moments with some administration folks that were embarrassed by some of the things we showed on recovery.gov. It was sort of good and bad for both political parties. There were many, many things on that site that embarrassed Democrats, and there were many things that kind of embarrassed Republicans, and so it sort of evened out. But learning to live with embarrassment should be part of embracing transparency, and I learned to live with it, so everybody else can. And then I would say that one of the biggest things I would say about my journey and lessons was that I'm an accountability guy, and how was the transparency going to help or hurt accountability? And actually, I came away from this thinking that transparency is a force multiplier for accountability. I mean, the fraud in the recovery program, which was estimated to be billions of dollars, is actually less than 0.5% today. And I think the principal reason for that is the transparency sat right beside our accountability platform, and that transparency drove accountability. The fact that every pundit, newspaper person, American citizen could see where that money was basically kept the bad guys away from the money. They just went and stole good old Medicare money and stayed away from that money and the transparency had put on this money. So I think it's a great example of when we move forward, we talk about preventing fraud, waste, that we always accompany an accountability platform with a transparency platform.
Thank you very
much. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. We have a question. My name is Gary Bass with the Bauman Foundation. And but first of all, I would agree with you, Earl. You accomplished a great deal. It was a precedent. I also agree with you. We could do more. I also had the pleasure of prodding you from the outside. The question I have relates to the last comment you made, which is there are a lot of folks who come out of the IG world and folks who are working inside government on spending transparency, and accountability is their watchword. They're very concerned about it. But yet, accountability is here, transparency is here. Somehow you evolved and really championed, evangelized transparency. What lessons could you tell us of what was that process that went through your own thinking, and what advice could you give to others in government about pushing the linkage between those two?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Gary, for those nice comments. I think that, and you were a pain in my butt for the first year or so, you and others. But quite frankly, I think I came away enriched by the participation that your group and other groups had with us. We went out and sought a lot of different opinions from people on how to set this transparency up, and Gary and others were very, very helpful to us. I didn't really realize what the role of transparency was with respect to accountability and how closely they're related until about halfway through the process. And then I realized that we had I was seeing a fairly low level of fraud in the recovery program, and I started thinking about it, and they say I'm from Massachusetts, and there's an old expression, dawn shined over Marblehead, and the light bulb came on, and I suddenly realized that it was probably a couple of things. Of course, we had some really super technology that were arrayed in a unique way for our accountability platform. The IGs had a major paradigm shift from trying to just simply detect fraud and waste to trying to prevent fraud and waste, which is a whole different ballgame and a whole different discussion, I might add. But finally, I came to believe that the transparency of this money, the amount of sunlight on this money, also kept the bad guys away. I didn't care why they kept away. I just knew that they were staying away from this money. And it was a very tempting pot of money. And I had imagined before I started this that they would come in droves, but in reality they really didn't. And I think as I look back, and I would advocate that the folks that are still in government that work in this arena, that they always sit transparency next to accountability when they're trying to keep fraud at a low level.
My name is Li Yang. About the transparency, I just wonder if you follow up, both from the contractors and employees, different point of view, and they follow up. Just like they always shuffling, and in Blackwater they changing the name, and government agency, the reorganizations, but there's always a loss of the name of the employee, so they always say they don't work here anymore. So I just wonder if you really follow up employee who didn't really follow the rules, or you will say there's a wrongdoings. Would you be able to say how much we just follow up the contractors, whether they are hired to do wrong things, but they just have different kind of mission in their statement? So did you follow up those?
Well, I think we're talking about something a little different. I think that, what we found was, and just a little bit in that arena, we never found any misbehavior on the part of government officials at all. There's very little fraud or waste that occurs between the movement of money between federal officials and state officials. As Sean mentioned earlier, it's when it starts going down to the sub-levels that we see, of course, the incidents of fraud go up. And there is a need to go down further, clearly. And by the way, I advocated to do that early on, and I was vetoed in that. But the further down you get, the more likelihood you are to discover fraud on our own rather than just waiting for the front page of the Des Moines Register to show us where it is.